just putting on a timer here quickly, so I'm sure 6 minutes per question. Right, so I'm going to go through the entire paper, and because I'm going to go through the entire paper, I'm not going to go into excruciating detail. This is just an overview, just what you need to know for the exam. All right, so before I get that timer started, let's have a look at what we're going to go through. So what we're looking at today, we're going to look at the Black Consciousness Movement. That's topic 1 or question 1 on the exam. Topic 2 or question 2 in the exam is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Black Conscious Movement and TRC are actually the ones that people really like to answer. So I'm just going to teach you some tips and tricks to go through those things. And then topic 3, I'm probably one of the only 3 teachers in the country that is doing topic 3 or question 3, which is globalization. It's not a popular question to answer, but I actually feel that it's more relevant because it's recent history. So it's basically from 1980 to about the mid-2000s. Actually, it can go up until 2014, 2015. So it's quite recent as far as history is concerned. And those that do economics and business, they are already familiar with it. Even kids that do geography are already familiar with globalization. So there's a lot of overlap in other subjects as well, which is why I chose to do it this year. We'll see how the results look at the end of the year, and then I'll decide if I'll go back to TRC. And then after the first 3 topics, which are your source base, you have the next 3 topics, which are your essay questions. So topic 4 is 1980s international resistance. So how do people fight back against apartheid? Then you've got topic 5, the road to democracy. That's also quite a popular one to answer. And then topic 6, also one of the not popular questions to answer, but surprisingly easy actually, which is the end of the Cold War. Right, so paper 2 is focused around South African history, or how world history will affect South Africa. And what I've noticed in the past, there's a current trend towards case studies. So they don't necessarily ask you specifically about the event or the topic, like they'll relate it to a specific thing that is happening, and then you're going to have to use your knowledge to answer those questions. So it's more about analysis and interpretation. So don't be surprised if you see something that you didn't do in class. You need to use your knowledge from class and apply it to the case study. Right, so if you want to go back to previous videos, just in general, when you're studying for paper 2, if you've got a smartphone, you should have a QR reader on your phone, and you can just take a picture of these 2 codes, or you can print this out and then take a picture of the codes, and it will take you to the YouTube video where I show how to answer source-based questions, and the other one that does essay writing, but basically just looking at how do you do the content, not really about line of argument or anything like that. So all said and done, let's go to topic 1, which is the Black Consciousness Movement. I'm starting my timer now. Right, so first of all, you need to know who this gentleman is over there. That is a man called Bantu Stephen BIKO. He is the leader of the Black Consciousness Movement. So you might get a source where they give you a picture of him. So it's very good of you to know how he looks like, as well as his ideas and how he influenced the Black Consciousness Movement. So one of the first questions that I can basically guarantee is going to be in the paper is they're going to ask you to define the term Black consciousness. So there's 2 ways to do it. The easy way to define Black consciousness is basically, it's the same thing as Black power, which is having pride in your Blackness, uplifting your Black community, this idea that Black is beautiful. So that's your easy definition of Black consciousness. There's also a more difficult definition, which is awareness of one's identity as a Black person, a philosophy of self-confidence among Black South Africans. So another part of this question would be, what is the Black consciousness movement? So you need to be able to tell the difference between the idea of Black consciousness, which is about being proud of being Black, and the actual movement, like the actions that they took to spread these ideas, to bring these ideas to life. And the Black consciousness movement started from the ground up after the ANC and the PAC were banned in the 1960s. It was a social movement for political consciousness aimed at freeing the minds of Black South Africans who had been made to feel inferior. Now, this is something that kids get confused with. They think that Black consciousness movement is like a political party. You can't go to the polls and vote for the Black consciousness movement. It's basically just an idea. It's something in your mind. You can't go and vote for a party, but the idea of Black consciousness can influence a party. So for example, later on we'll speak a little bit about the ZAPO and other political parties that are based around the idea of Black consciousness. Black consciousness eventually sparked an event on the 16th of June 1976 called the SOWETO Uprising, where 176 people were killed, mainly by the police, as students marched to protest the use of the Afrikaans language in African schools. So when they ask this question, they either ask about the role of Steve BIKO or they'll ask about the Soweto Uprising. They kind of play around with different ways of answering this question. And why is the Black consciousness movement important? Because it causes unrest to spread like wildfire throughout the country. So you've got a lot of people that are light up because of Black consciousness. Their minds become widened, they become aware, and this inspires them to fight back, to stand up for themselves. So that's why the Black consciousness movement is important. So what did they accomplish? They had Black identity and psychological liberation. So Black people started to be proud of being Black. They started standing up for themselves, things like that. The Azanian People's Organization, or AZAPO, was formed. So that's a political party that is based off the ideas of Black consciousness. Former members of the Black consciousness movement continued to join the ANC in exile. So we have more people fighting back against apartheid because of Black consciousness. They start up Black community programs, or BCPs. They start self-help groups for Black communities. So quite similar to Black Power from Paper One, where you go into your community and you uplift your community. You have feeding schemes, you have tutoring schemes, things like that, all about uplifting Black people. They also publish various journals, including the Black Review, Black Voice, Black Perspective, and Creativity in Development. So what did they accomplish? Although it successfully put in place a system of local communities to help organize resistance, unfortunately, the Black consciousness movement was targeted by the security police and basically kind of started to fall apart towards the end of the 1970s. Despite this, however, they still were responsible for fighting back up until into the 80s, where we know that there was a lot of internal and external resistance, which eventually led to the end of apartheid. But basically by mid-1970s, a lot of Black consciousness leaders kind of get banned. They get confined to remote rural districts. They're not allowed to speak their truth. In 1977, all Black consciousness movement related organizations and publications were banned. Many of their leaders were arrested and their social programs were dismantled. In September 1977, Steve BIKO, who was the leader of the Black consciousness movement, died from injuries that resulted from interrogation while in the custody of police. So they said he died of a hunger strike, but when they actually had a look at the body, you could see there were bruises. He was basically tortured to death. And then basically you can summarize the Black consciousness movement into this phrase, which is Black man, you are on your own. You need to fight. Ooh, I'm running out of time. Which means basically you need to fight for yourself. You need to stand up for yourself. So how do they ask this question? The question here is typically asked in one of three ways. They may ask about the role a particular person played in the Black consciousness movement. The popular one is Steve Biko, but they might also ask you about people like Barney Pitiana or Uncle Putsatiro, but usually it's Steve Biko. They may also ask about a specific event during the Black consciousness movement, for example, the banning of the SOWETO or the Soweto uprising. And they may also ask about the Black consciousness movement as a whole. Was it successful? Did it achieve its aim? So this is an example of how it has been asked in the past. So you can see they'll give you a picture. This one is specifically about Steve Biko. So you can see they give you a picture of Steve Biko, Biko and solidarity, the word solidarity meaning everyone is together, they're united. So they're saying Biko has united Black people. If you look at the picture, that's why I say it's important to know how Steve Biko looks, because they give you pictures like this and then they ask, who's this? And then you don't know how he looks. So Steve Biko, and then you can see his hands are shackled. Now, one of the famous quotes that is attributed to Steve Biko is this idea of breaking the shackles of oppression. So this image is showing him literally breaking the handcuffs. Could also be a reference to the fact that he died in police custody. So you can see Black People's Convention's tribute to the late Honorary President Bantu Stephen Biko, One Azania, One Nation. So there you see Azapo again using Steve Biko, being inspired by Steve Biko. And then if you look at the sources that they give you, you'll see they'll give you a source very much aligned with the ideas of Steve Biko and how he influenced the Black consciousness movement. So the reason I'm doing this with you is because I want to show you, when I go to the next slide, you'll see how it's slightly different depending on the way they ask the question. So this sources was all based on what was the role and influence of Steve Biko. So all of the sources kind of speak to that Steve Biko. Right, so this is a different way they can ask. So they can also ask you about SASO or SASM, the South African Students Organization or the South African Students Movement. And you can see that the way they ask it now is slightly different. So now they're not telling you about Steve Biko. In fact, they don't even mention Steve Biko at all. Now all the sources are focused on SASO. So you'll see here, there's a newspaper article why the Minister of Justice banned SASO. And then you see a picture of one of the journals that the Black Consciousness Movement published where you have the banned SASO leaders. So this was actually in last year's paper. And people had to draw a comparison between the written source and the visual source. So a lot of teachers don't actually focus too much on SASO. So you'll speak about how SASO inspired the students of Soweto, but you won't specifically speak about SASO. So a lot of the information that you use to answer these types of questions would come from the source itself. I just want to speak about something that people struggled with last year, which is that last line there, which says that earlier, Mrs. Suzman warned the government that it could ban Black leaders, but others would rise up in their place, for government was responsible for creating an indestructible Black nationalism, which is only a byproduct of white nationalism. So there was a question on that in last year's paper that a lot of students didn't know how to answer because I think they didn't know what nationalism was. So nationalism from grade 11, you will know, is the idea of being proud of your country, being proud of your culture, heritage, race, etc. So Black nationalism is a byproduct of white nationalism. So because white people are creating this society where Black people are excluded, you've got Black people standing up for themselves and making their own alternative structures. So that's just like if you get a similar question, I don't think you will, but just so that you know how to answer that in future. And then if you look at the picture, you'll see that there's a Black Power salute. Once again, the raised Black clenched fist showing Black power, showing Black pride, showing standing up for yourself, and then the 8 leaders that were banned. The other way this question can be asked is on the Soweto uprising, so how Black consciousness influenced students to stand up for themselves. Everyone should be aware of this image of Hector Peterson, where he was murdered by the apartheid police while protesting against having to do Afrikaans as a language of learning and teaching. And then you'll see there that the sources will be aligned to how Black consciousness made students basically stand up for themselves. And then the other way it can be asked is how Black consciousness was successful or unsuccessful. So you look at how it influenced groups like SASO to form, how it encouraged people to stand up for themselves, encouraged uprisings, things like that. So that's the different ways that they can ask Black consciousness. All right, so now we move on to topic 2. So that was a little bit longer than I intended. So let me try and spend 10 minutes per question. Let's see if that helps. So topic 2, the TRC. So the key people in the TRC that you need to know, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, are Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. Alex Boraine, who was the deputy chair, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, sorry, being the chairperson, and Dula Auma, who was the Minister of Justice. There were 3 committees in the TRC, which was the Human Rights Violation Committee, the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee, and the Amnesty Committee. So you'll have a look, Human Rights Violation Committee, their job was basically to investigate the human rights abuses that occurred during apartheid, and very specifically, they only looked at human rights abuses which occurred from 1960 to about 1994. They didn't investigate things that happened before 1960 because that was mainly your petty apartheid, grand apartheid, people being removed from their homes, people having laws that forbid them from going into certain areas. But the real torturing and killing and violence really only started happening in the 1960s to 1994, which is why that is the period of time that the TRC is focused on. The other committee is the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. So one of the questions they may ask you is, what does the word reparation mean? And the short version is, it's just payback. So if your family member was hurt or had something taken away from them or was tortured or they were killed during apartheid, the purpose of the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee was to restore or try and make things better by kind of paying you back for what you've lost. The problem is you can't always, like if someone's dead, money doesn't fill that hole, but it can help. So one of the ways they also ask this is that they will ask you about restorative justice and retributive justice. So this path you take, whether you either choose an eye for an eye, revenge, we want to hurt, or restorative justice, which is let's forgive, let's move on. Usually with TRC, you have to say whether they were successful or not because they chose the route of restorative justice. The next thing we have is the Amnesty Committee, which was this idea. So that might also be a question they ask you, what is amnesty? And amnesty is kind of like an umbrella. So if rain is punishment, amnesty is this umbrella that is going to protect you from punishment. So if you get amnesty, you won't go to jail for a crime that you have committed. So the Amnesty Committee's job was to look at the different human rights violations, things that happen, and then the victims would be referred to the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee, and the perpetrators or the bad guys, they would be referred to the Amnesty Committee. So you can apply for amnesty, which means you won't go to jail for the crime that you commit. So let's just have a look. So I have explained this. I'll just go through it quickly. The Human Rights Violation Committee were tasked with investigating all human rights abuses that occurred from 1960 to 1994. They discovered the identity of the victim, the extent of the harm suffered, and whether the violation was a result of planning by an organization. So a lot of the violence during apartheid was state sanctioned, which means that the government told people to kill people. And they wanted to kind of split this from personal things. So like, for example, maybe some gender-based violence, somebody gets killed, you need to separate that from when the government is actually saying, let's kill this person. So that's why the human rights violation had to go and investigate and find out what's happening there, get to the truth. That's why it's called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. The victims were referred to the Reparations Committee and the perpetrators were referred to the Amnesty Committee. Their whole purpose was to find out the truth of what had happened during the apartheid. So here's a picture by Zapiro. You'll probably get a Zapiro cartoon for this topic. They're quite fond of that. So you see the white South Africa, here's the truth about apartheid. So you see depravity, murder, assassinations, state terrorism, torture, abductions, TRC, and then you see a little newspaper in the bin. TRC ends 15 months of human rights violations hearings. So you see that the white South African is sitting on the chair, and you know that phrase, in one ear, out the other. So they hear about all the horrible things that the apartheid government did, and they don't really take it in, they don't really feel anything. Very, very generalized and everything like that. So if they were to ask you what is the message of a cartoon like this, your message would be that white South Africans are ignoring all of the truth and the things that the TRC basically exposed. Right, so the next thing is the Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. They were tasked with providing support to the victims of human rights abuses. Their primary job was to restore the dignity of the victim and to produce policy ideas on how to help survivors and their communities. Their focus was on healing, or what we call restorative justice. So you'll see there's a big ship with the word reparations on. Remember, reparations meaning payback. We've got the TRC that is pointing at a person in a wheelchair on an island. And then you'll see there's a word there, victim. So the person that's on the island is the victim and he's screaming for help. And if you have a look there, you can see that the government and the ANC is looking in the completely opposite direction. So in this case, the message of the cartoon would be that the victims need to get reparations, but what's happening is that they are being ignored by the government and the ANC. Right, the next thing is the Amnesty Committee. Remember, amnesty was about get out of jail free card, think of it like that. They were tasked with looking at all amnesty applications. So what the TRC basically, to get perpetrators to come and tell the truth, they offered them amnesty for their crimes. So like, if you killed someone, you're not going to go in front of the world and say, hey, I killed this person. So to get people to come in front and admit to what they did, they offered them amnesty, which means you won't go to jail for what you did. However, there were conditions. You didn't just get amnesty. So amnesty could only be granted if the following conditions were fulfilled. The act had to be politically motivated, meaning you had to kill that person because either the government or a certain organization told you to kill or assassinate that person. And the applicant had to tell the entire truth. If it was found that you were lying, you would not get amnesty. Now, one of the controversial things about the amnesty process was that you weren't required to show remorse. So you could say, well, I killed this person, he was a communist, he was a terrorist, and this is what I did, and this is how I killed him, and all of those things. And the family of that victim have to sit and listen to this. And it was very traumatic for them. And then at the end of all of that, these people would be granted amnesty, meaning nothing happens to them. They just get out of jail free. And a lot of people felt unsatisfied with the amnesty process. So over here, you can see a picture of some of the people that committed horrible crimes during apartheid. And you can see there this idea of blanket amnesty, like here you go, covered with amnesty, covered with indemnity, you're not going to be in trouble. And then we've got Dullah Omar, the Minister of Justice, just removing that. You're not getting indemnity. You have to admit to your crimes. You have to admit to what you did wrong. At the bottom there, you can see gloating may not be in the spirit of national reconciliation, but don't you just love to see them squirm? So that's Zakir's little comment on the amnesty. So how is this question asked? It's really only asked in one way, which was basically, was the TRC successful in? And then they'll look at one of the committees. So were they successful in finding out the truth with the Human Rights Violation Committee? Were they successful in granting reparations? Were they successful in amnesty? So that's really the only way that they ask it. And then they'll look at one particular committee, and then they will give you a case study. So they'll give you a just one thing where the TRC actually investigated this thing and whether they were successful or not. Did they manage to reconcile the nation? Right, so case studies are usually based on recent events. So for example, in 2017, in the paper, the murder inquest of Ahmed Timol was reopened, and at the end of the year in November, they actually asked about Ahmed Timol. And then in 2019, it was the 20-year anniversary of Ashley Krill's killer getting amnesty. And once again, at the end of the year, that's what they asked. So if you want to kind of get ahead of the game and kind of predict what's coming in the paper, you can ask yourself, what is in the news this year? What are they talking about? Because every year there's somebody that got amnesty, or there's some inquest that has been reopened, or there's some kind of event where they're commemorating what happened to someone during the struggle. Ask yourself what is in the news, and then more or less you can kind of suss out that the case study will be on one of those things. So here's what I like to call a cheat sheet. It's basically general statements that you can use when answering this question, especially if the question is asking you about whether it was a successful or not. So with positives, you can say that the TRC created a platform for victims and perpetrators to tell their story. During the TRC hearings, some of the truth surfaced. In some cases, perpetrators sought forgiveness and provided families with answers. In 1996, the majority of South Africans agreed that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission contributed to reconciliation. Reparations were small, but they were received by some victims, and reparations helped victims regain their dignity. So if it's asking you whether it was successful or not, that's kind of your cheat sheet to say, yeah, this is why it was successful. Their aim was to find the truth and to reconcile the nation, and they found the truth and they reconciled the nation. However, you can also take the opposite approach. You can say that the TRC was not successful, and then you can say kind of generally that the cross-examination of victims was not allowed. Political parties were not prepared to take any blame for the violent crimes that were committed. The persons who gave the order for the crimes that were committed were still not revealed. So just on that point, there was actually an image that we got a few years ago with when you had these little small fish that were being caught, and then the big fish, which were like your PW boaters that were getting away with what they had, the crimes they had committed during the apartheid. So the big fish, the big head honchos didn't get in trouble, but the guys at the bottom, the small fry, they got in trouble. The TRC was regarded as a witch hunt that opened old wounds, and many families were still looking for answers. So not everyone got to the truth, and not everybody wanted to forgive. They wanted basically retributive justice. Perpetrators were not held accountable for the crimes that were committed. So because of amnesty, people basically got away with murder, abduction, torture, all of those things. So what is the message of the cartoon? We dealt with as much evidence as we could. Over there, we've got Thabo Mbeki was the president of South Africa. We've got the final TRC report handed to him by Desmond Tutu. And at the back there, you can see apartheid forces basically shredding all of the evidence that they didn't deal with, getting rid of it like it didn't happen. So the message of the cartoon, TRC, though they did manage to get some of the truth, a lot of it was unsuccessful in reconciling the nation. And even if we look at the nation today, a lot of old wounds are still there. They just kind of swept it under the rug, and now it's starting to come out again. Right, so now let's do topic 3, globalization. Let's do this another 10 minutes. Let's go. Whew. So this topic was focused on how the world has changed since the 1980s. The focus is usually on how a more unified world has affected South Africa. So if you have a look there, you can see this is supposed to be the world. You can see it's shaped like a globe. And then the person here is saying, careful, it's extremely unbalanced. And you can see it's divided into north and south. And you've got the UN over there. So globalization is all about how countries in the northern part of the hemisphere are basically flying high, rich countries, and countries in the southern part of the world are not benefiting at all. So there's two main focuses in this topic. Before I go into that, I just need to explain that globalization is how the entire world is working together. So this is a fairly new thing. So even though globalization has existed in the past, where you had countries working together, it hasn't ever existed at this scale because of what we have with technology, internet, aeroplanes, things like that. We can suddenly very quickly get between two different countries, and that basically makes the world a village, a smaller version of itself. So there are two main focuses in this topic. So you either will look at North-South cooperation or South-South cooperation. Kids that do economics will be familiar with this. So North-South cooperation is when first world countries, or so-called rich countries, help third world countries, or so-called poor countries. The main players there would be the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Union. When we look at South-South cooperation, we have third or former second world countries helping other third world countries. So second world countries are countries that used to be communist. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're poor, but they're just not part of this capitalist agenda like that the West basically follows. So the main player there would be BRICS, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank. So when they ask this question, they'll either focus on North-South cooperation or they'll focus on South-South cooperation. So one of the topics that they'll go into might be structural adjustment policies, which basically are these loans that are given to third world countries from first world countries. So the rich countries give poor countries loans. And the positive of that is that it removes excess government controls and promotes market competition. So it makes it easier for rich countries to compete with poor countries, get their goods into our country. For example, if you think about things like the Apple or the Apple phone or stuff like that, like we can import it very easily because of the government controls that have been lifted. Third world countries can get loans or low interest subsidies from the richer countries. And there's an influx of multinational companies. So for example, things like McDonald's, Burger King, they can come into our country and provide jobs, provide opportunities, things like that, and foreign direct investments into the country. So if they come here with their $1, that's like 20 Rand for us. So it really helps our economy boom if done correctly. And that's the big if. So most of the time, structural adjustment policies are actually negative because currencies are devalued, it becomes worth less. There is a reduction of government services because when you take this loan, they come with strings attached. You have to have spending cuts, you have to have budget cuts, particularly in health and education. Wages are kept low because obviously if you are having a multinational corporation in your own country, you'd have to pay people in your currency, and then you'd have to pay them a fair wage. And then what ends up happening is that if you're going in a third world country, you can kind of get away with paying them lower amounts of money, because to them it seems like a lot of money. So for example, if an American came here and gave you $1, that's 20 Rand, you can buy yourself a chip roll, buy yourself some cool drink. But for them, what can you do with the $1? And business is deregulated, which makes it a little bit more difficult for local businesses to thrive. So there's lower imports, tariffs on imports, and tighter monetary policy, which basically means that yes, we can get things from overseas, but they end up kind of overwhelming our local markets. So therefore, it increases poverty, and poor nations are essentially blackmailed into accepting these loans. So if you don't accept these loans, you don't get to play with the big boys, as they say. The other thing is BRICS. So if they don't ask about structural adjustment policies or North-South cooperation, then they'll ask about South-South cooperation, which could be defined as BRICS. In the background, you can see all the members of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. By the BRICS itself, you can see our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. So what's the positives there? BRICS can help South Africa with infrastructure programs such as developmental skills. Russia can supply South Africa with nuclear energy. China will supply South Africa with railways. So BRICS kind of creates a network between these third world and second world, former second world countries, basically working together, helping each other out. The negatives are that BRICS partner countries have their own agendas. Once again, the help comes with strings attached. So yes, we get nuclear energy from Russia, but who's the world's biggest exporter of uranium? Russia. So they benefit from it as well. So BRICS member countries sell similar things. So there's a risk of cheap imports overwhelming local markets. So think about it, like we've got 110 Chinatowns, but we won't find a South Africa town in China. Loans from BRICS and the New Development Bank need to be paid back. So we kind of tap into this bank that BRICS created, but we have to eventually, the Pied Piper must be paid and the money must be paid back. Some of the other positives is that BRICS countries can help South Africa to export goods to them in their regions in Asia, South America, and Eastern Europe. So it kind of opens up the market to us. We're not restricted to trading with our old trading partner. We can now trade with basically all these different countries. And they actually make up, I think, 45% of the world, the BRICS countries. I mean, China alone contributes, I think, how many billion people? Not sure. I think it was 1 or 2 billion people from China alone. So entering an alliance with China makes it really easy for us to sell our things in China. So we've got the study that shows that South African trade had increased from 2001 to 2011 from 5 billion to almost 25 billion. So we are benefiting from our alliances with the BRICS countries, and exports from South Africa to BRICS countries grew to 25 billion. South Africa is kind of an underdog. So if you look at the negative again, so we kind of the small one, the baby, compared to these big boys. And there's an unfair tariff system between South Africa and BRICS countries. So they charge us more to bring our stuff there than it is for them to bring their stuff here. And a lot of the BRICS member countries are very interested in our minerals and our diamonds and our gold and our infrastructure, and there's always this danger that our minerals and infrastructure will fall in the hands of BRICS countries. So how do they ask this question? Like the TRC, they only ask this question in one way, which is, how did globalization affect South Africa? So as long as you know the positives and the negatives, you can answer this question no matter what they give you. So they may focus on the North-South cooperation, which is the World Bank, the IMF, or the South-South cooperation, which is BRICS. You may also get a case study. So here's your cheat sheet again. Just in general, you kind of have to apply it to whatever sources you get. But in general, the positives of globalization is that investment helps countries by providing new jobs and skills. It brings wealth and foreign currency to local economies, and extra money can be spent on education, health, and infrastructure. It allows for the sharing of ideas, experiences, and lifestyles of people and cultures. People can experience food and other products not previously available in their countries. Globalization increases awareness of events in faraway parts of the world, and third world countries gain technological advancements and loans from first world countries. So that's just in general some of the positives. Whether they ask about structural adjustment or whether they ask about BRICS, you can always use these positives. The positives are always the same. And then if you look at the negatives are also always the same. Globalization operates in the interest of rich countries at the expense of poor countries. So rich countries get richer, poor countries get poorer. Then you've got third world countries, mostly to provide the North and West with cheap labor and raw materials. There are no guarantees that the wealth from inward investment will benefit the local community, and profits are sent back to rich countries. Transnational companies, so big companies like McDonald's, may drive local companies out of business. Absent of strictly enforced international laws mean that big companies may pollute the environment and run risks with safety or impose working conditions and low wages on local workers. Globalization is viewed by many as a threat to the world's cultural diversity. So that's your negatives, just really in general, and then you can just apply it to whatever case study they give you. Right, so this is an example of how this question is asked. So source A will usually explain what globalization is. Usually they'll even ask you a question like define the term globalization in your own words, and it's basically just the easy way to say it is all the countries are working together, and then positives about it, the negatives about it. So source A will really go into that kind of detail. Source B is usually the case study, so it focuses on a certain section. So for example, in this case, how did globalization affect the textile industry? So cloth and clothing and things like that. And I always use the example of my own aunt who lost her job in the early 2000s at a clothing factory. So she used to make patterns for dresses. And then when they opened up our economy to cheap imports, her factory had to close down and then she lost her job. So that's basically what that source is actually explaining. How the opening up the South Africa to the rest of the world led to our own factories starting to close down. And then source C or source D would be the visual source or the result of this globalization. So here you can see in the picture, you've got a guy, kind of looks Chinese, and you've got the, what's called, the sewing machine, which says SA textile industry. It's being controlled by China, and you can see that a lot of people are just being crushed in that thing. And then you'll see there's a short thing on the side that says since 2001, more than 800 firms and 100,000 jobs have disappeared from the South African textile industry. So the message there would be globalization had a negative effect on the South African textile industry, caused a loss of jobs, it worked in the benefit of China to the detriment of South Africa, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm going to stop this here and then I'm going to make a new video where we speak about the essay questions. So are there any questions about source base? You can always just pop it in the comments. But yeah, cool. Let's stop this here.